This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Thank you to all my patrons on patreon.com, and thank you to my newest patrons, Sharon, Ruby, John, and Joseph. If you too would like an ad-free experience of the podcast, please become a patron at any level at patreon.com/gracefulatheist. The Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group continues to thrive. We are trying to be a safe place to land to doubt, question, deconstruct, and even deconvert. The Tuesday night podcast discussions are now happening on Zoom, so please come and be a part of the community and part of the Hangouts. You can find that at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Friend of the podcast, Matthew Taylor, who is the co-host of Still Unbelievable, was recently on the premier Christianity podcast Unbelievable with Justin Brierley, and he did an amazing job talking about Mike DiVirgilio's Uninvented. Matthew is stellar in that discussion. I just wanted to shout him out and have you all listen to that episode. I'm going to be featured on the Beyond Atheism podcast in the next week or two. They were on this podcast in November, and they have returned the favor, so look out for that episode as well. Special thanks to Mike T. for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Taylor Yoder. Taylor describes herself as being in the trenches of deconstruction and deconversion. Taylor grew up as a person of faith. She had a personal sense of her relationship with Jesus. But watching her father die of cancer, she began to ask more questions. She looked out to apologetics to find those answers, but the answers she found were very weak. And then Trump and ultimately the pandemic took place, and Taylor found herself in the trenches of deconstruction and deconversion. You can find Taylor on Instagram at skeptical_heretic. The link will be in the show notes. Here is Taylor Yoder to tell her story. Taylor Yoder, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thanks for having me, David.
Taylor, I loved your email to me. You said that you were currently in the trenches of deconstruction and deconversion. And that's kind of the sweet spot for the podcast. So I'm excited to hear your story. We always begin with what was your faith tradition growing up and what was that like?
So growing up as a child, I went to a church called Maranatha Brethren Church. And during that time period, I would say like during elementary school years, I was also going to private Christian school. And then my dad was very adamant about, bringing devotionals to like the home and stuff. So every night after dinner, we would have a routine of doing devotions after dinner. And that stayed constant in my life until I moved out. And then when I got a little older, around middle school, my parents wanted to switch to public school, and they switched to a non-denominational church. I think they thought I think the non-denominational church they did because I think they saw, at least me, I don't know about my brother, struggling a little bit in the first church we were in. So We went to non-denominational church. That was good for a while. I was excited because I could wear jeans. That was like my first real excitement. I didn't have to dress up anymore. And so that was good at first. Then a little bit into it, it got pretty rough in the way that I had ended up liking one of as much as you can like someone at 13 years old, a boy who was the son of the two youth leaders at that church. And something, I don't really remember. It was so long ago and I was so young. I just remember something had happened where like, I guess I didn't really like him anymore, and things kind of went awry after that.
Oh no, you had the audacity to break up with the youth leader's son.
I didn't know what I was getting myself into that young, but
yeah.
That was actually the first time the whole purity culture thing kind of hit me in the face because I got called like a whore in youth group and I didn't know what that
Oh
meant.
my
Like
God.
I
I'm
had
so
never
sorry.
it's okay. I never knew what that word meant. I was like, I don't know, I barely knew boys at that point. But it got bad after that point because his parents didn't like me then. The whole youth group, he was so involved with the youth group that, they kind of followed his lead type thing. So then eventually I was old enough to leave the youth group, thank God, because I didn't want to be there anymore. And
Yes.
my youngest brother joined youth group at that point, and I remember he came home and told me like they told me that I shouldn't grow up to be like you, and hopefully I don't grow up to be like you. And I was like, oh, that's that's nice.
Wow. Wow. That is so terrible.
That was like my first, I guess, bad experience with like the Christian community. But then thankfully after that, my dad allowed me to pick my own church. So I was able to pick a church that some of my friends went to and I felt more comfortable. So that was good for me because I felt like I felt way more of a connection when I got to pick for myself. Because my dad's rule was like, as long as you live in this house, you have to go to church. So I was like, okay.
Okay.
And then I moved out of my parents' house around 21 years old, I think. And after that, I kind of didn't go to church anymore. Church wasn't really important to me. And I think a reason for that is my dad always emphasized the like personal relationship with God. I don't even really know what that means anymore, but like at the time, I felt like I knew what it meant. Um, so yeah, that's kind of all there was with that.
So, I mean, that's a pretty god awful experience with purity culture. But did you, like you say, who knows what it actually means, a personal relationship? But during that time, did you have a sense of a connection to God
Yeah,
personally?
I think I really did. Especially when I was moving out, my dad had we found out he had stage 4 glioblastoma and that, it was
I'm
terminal.
sorry.
And that thanks. And he that was hard, but I think at the time it actually made my faith stronger because I really clung on to the idea of, seeing him again and that he was going to go to like a good place. And I feel like in a way it really put a band-aid on grieving. Even like after he passed, it was a big, like, it felt like I didn't really have to deal with it because I was given this idea that life is just very temporary and the
Hmm.
big part of life is going to be after we die. So I feel like what I know now, I would have cherished a lot more moments back then, like while he was sick and stuff. But yeah, during that time was hard. And then my mother during that time also had a very bad drug addiction. And during when my
Okay.
dad was got sick, it was kind of like this time where we're like, okay, she's either gonna change and get better for the sake of my father, or it's gonna explode. And it definitely exploded.
Oh man.
um,
Taylor, by the way, I can relate. I've got many stories of my mother as well, so very similar.
yeah. I never really had a good relationship with her. It was kind of weird. I lived in the same house with her my whole life, but she like was almost in her room all the time, but I didn't realize what was going on until I was about like 17, 18. Even though I saw her go to rehabs, but I didn't know what they were. I know that sounds strange, but
Okay. Yeah.
I wasn't aware. I knew something was going on, but I was never really told. But so during that time when my dad was sick, things got so bad with her that we actually like got a townhouse for my dad to live in to kind of hide him from my mother because he had gone so long without having any peace in his life because of my mom that like we just wanted to give him the gift of like dying in peace essentially.
Okay.
So she was like actively trying to find him, and it felt really, and like some days it felt cruel, and then other ways we were like, he's put up with so much, he's done so much in his life that he deserves this type of peace at the end. So that's what we decided. And then after he passed away, um, I just ended up not like speaking to her anymore at all. I think the last conversation with her was she said, "You have to forgive me and you have to keep me in your life or you're not like a true Christian." And that was kind of like the last like straw with it because I felt like it was another form of manipulation, like attacking my faith. So the past like 5 or 6 years, that's when it happened, like about 6 years ago. I feel like I was just kind of in this weird period where I was super depressed, but that's just kind of how I lived because I was used to it at a certain point. It was almost like the standard for me. And then the past like couple of years, it got really bad to the point where I was like, okay, I need to be in therapy. I need to maybe be in medicine or get on medicine. And so
Okay.
I did that. And it was very strange because the second I like started healing and like unpacking stuff, I almost had the motivation to like really look into my faith and my religion, and start asking questions. As in before, when I was really depressed, I felt like I needed that religion. Like I needed it to make me feel better. And like now that I was feeling better, I was like, wait, I did this on my own. Like I helped myself. And that's the only reason I got better.
Yeah, and that can be both really empowering and a little bit terrifying, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah. It was definitely terrifying. But um, those past like 4 or 5 or 6 years, I had struggled with it because while I'm going to school, I'm also working at Starbucks. So I came from like a really small town, and Starbucks is
Okay.
obviously like really liberal. And I got to work with all sorts of people, all different genders and sexualities, and just everything you could think of. And I felt so strange feeling like I couldn't fully accept the people I was working with like 8 hours a day, every day. And it didn't feel right to me. So stuff started changing for me in the way that I was like, I was told like on paper these are my morals or these are my values, but I didn't feel that way, and I was like cherry picking to the point where there was like hardly anything left. And then I realized towards the end I was like ashamed to call myself a Christian. I was embarrassed.
I can relate, yeah.
I was like, do I really belong to a community if I'm embarrassed to say that I'm part of that community? Is what I was asking myself. So, yeah, that it got to that point, and then so like I said, when I started actually being in a good headspace to investigate about how I really felt, because I actually had the energy, I just like couldn't believe what I was finding. Like I was honestly just researching in the Bible, and people in my family had told me that. I told them I felt kind of weird about things, and I didn't really know what was going on. They're like, "You just have to dig deeper in the Bible," and I was like, "Well, okay," but it had the
Mhm.
complete opposite effect. So yeah, and I felt so I don't know. I felt so shocked. Like there were so many things I was reading and finding out that I felt like I was crazy. I was like, why didn't anybody say anything about all of these things that are awful?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think for a long time, I was aware of, some of the things that were in the Bible that were awful. And I always thought, well, somebody smarter than me, someone else knows how to, explain this or like, understands this. And I had a very similar experience to you in that when I finally on my own went to go look for, okay, what are these answers? It was amazing. It was turtles all the way down. There was no substance to it. And it was
Yeah.
just shocking to discover that.
Yeah. And I didn't even know, like, I was researching a lot, but I didn't even know what apologetics was. Like,
Hmm.
I never knew what that was. And I was like, well, that makes sense why they need that because some of this stuff is like awful. And
Yeah.
not only that, but I got really specific into like translations and stuff. And when I started doing that, the whole idea of hell like really fell apart for me because I also was hanging out with my friends one night, and one of them one of them is Jewish, and I was asking him
Hmm.
questions. I was like, "So why don't if you believe in the Old Testament, why don't you believe in hell? Because hell is in the Old Testament. And he was like, no, it's not. I was like, what? What do you mean? And he was like,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
it's not. That was added later. And I just, it's like, it just, that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. I was like,
Okay.
wow. And then I also thought about like how many times I had heard that like the Jewish people were God's chosen people. And I was like, if they don't believe this, then how am I believing this kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely, with hindsight, again, to think about how often Christians oppose Jewish theology, and yet they're simultaneously saying these are the chosen people, and that is just
Right.
a bizarre, a bizarre way of thinking.
Right. It's very bizarre. Yeah. So like when I was researching that and like the origins of like hell and just different ideas in the Bible, I was like, wow, I was seeing how a lot of it was taken from like Greek mythology and things like in the New Testament. And it just felt like a kind of like people taking ideas from other like religions or stories. And it felt so off. But at the same time, going through this thing, and I'm sure a lot of people describe this, it was honestly really scary. It was a lot
Hmm.
of emotions at once. Um, but the reason I was holding on to faith for I feel like a long time was because of my dad. And my dad was just such a good guy and important person in my life that the idea that I wasn't sure if I would see him again or where he was or what he was doing was really intense for me. And I was talking to a friend about that actually, and he looked at me and was like, Taylor, you're gonna have to grieve your dad all over again. And I just like I came to that realization. I was like, wow, like you're right, and I really don't want to do that, but like
Hmm.
I feel like I have to. And but then in that process also I felt like I didn't really grieve him the first time because of what I said about I feel like sometimes Christianity puts the band-aid on grief where it's
Yeah.
just kind of like this is temporary. Yeah.
This is a common theme that
Yeah.
you aren't allowed to grieve the loss because you have to say all the right things that they're in a better place and what have you, and just like you say, then at some point in time you experience grief on another level when you let go of the idea of heaven.
Yeah. And that level felt real because to me before it was kind of like numbness and some sadness, but the second time felt very real, very deep, intense feelings. But it also felt good to finally feel those feelings because I think they were there the whole time, but it was hard to feel them with that kind of ideology, I guess.
I do think that's the point, is that as human beings, we have to grieve. We have to feel the feeling of loss and experience that and go through it. And when we're masking that, when we're pretending like that's invalid in some way, it doesn't make it go away. It just postpones
Mhm.
when that's going to hit you.
Right. And like I feel like when you see other Christians around you being like, it's okay, this is temporary, you're just like, okay. And it's just kind of a like convincing yourself type thing. Like along with that, when I was because I had been thinking about my dad a lot during this process, I thought about, what a good dad he was, what a good relationship we had. And then I started looking at my earthly father versus my heavenly father. And I was like, the
Yeah.
stuff that God is doing or the stuff that God had done and is threatening to do, my father would never do to me. I feel like my father was like, I felt true unconditional love from him. So I knew what it was like to have a good relationship with my father. So the relationship with God felt like abusive because
Right.
it didn't feel the same and I couldn't grasp the understanding of having to fear someone you love, like saying that you should fear God and also love him. That felt weird and not right to me because I couldn't think of one example in my life where I was afraid of someone and also just love them so deeply. And so like that was a big idea that was a big thought for me growing up was everyone seemed okay with the concept of being afraid of someone but then somehow out of the goodness of their heart just choosing to love them and I'm like but I feel like we just love him because we don't want to go to hell. So it felt
Yeah.
not genuine.
Well, and you were being honest with yourself, right?
Yeah,
I think it's easy to not be honest with yourself and just follow along with what you're told.
right. The whole deconstruction thing was also scary for me because every single person in my family is a very strong, devout Christian, even like all of distant relatives, like every single relative that I have. So I was like thinking to myself, do I really want to go down this path and be the first person in my family to be this kind of giant, like elephant in the room every time we get together? Like, I'm the one who doesn't believe. And this was all around the same time as like the Christmas and Thanksgiving that just came up. And all of a sudden, us all praying in the same room together felt so strange. I was like, I'd done this my whole life, and now it was like
Yeah.
so weird.
Can I ask who knows? Have you talked to people? Is that something that you've been public about or
Um, Not really, but like at this point, I'm okay with like I'm starting to be like I will only kind of talk about it with people who ask. But I talked to it about some with my sister, who's a very devout Christian, and she tried to answer some questions for me, but she was also truthful in the way that she's like, I don't have all the answers for this, which like I appreciated that. And I did end up getting a debate on Christmas, super fun, and with some of my aunts and my
Okay.
brother. And I know my aunt is a very devout Christian, so I wanted to know. Like I was curious. It wasn't to say this isn't true. I just wanted to know, her answers for things. But kind of what I feel like I got was a circle of, God is God and we'll never understand him. And then I said, well, then can I not question him? They're like, oh no, well you can. I'm like, but how can I if I'll just never understand? And
Right.
I just the questions didn't satisfy anything. It kind of felt like it was just blind faith, which I knew like growing up, and for some reason all of a sudden it was like a shock to me, but it's because I wasn't really like looking into it.
There's a term for that, the discussion ending phrases like God is above our ways, and like it just stops the conversation and it protects the believer from actually having to dig any deeper.
Right.
You can Google this kind of thing, but like there's lists of those, and you start to recognize them when you're in a conversation with someone, and it's debatable whether or not you're gonna move that person, but you can recognize it for yourself. This conversation has been shut down. Not take it personally that it's not about you. It's them
Right.
protecting their own faith.
Yeah, exactly. There are a couple of things that now that I'm starting to realize that there are a couple of things that Christians will say that you're right, they're like conversation enders. I'm like,
Yeah.
well, there's nothing else I can say past that because they don't really want to engage in that type of conversation. And I understand because it's hard and it's difficult. And I think one thing they struggle with is that I'm okay with not knowing things. Like they think because I don't believe in God, I'm gonna have an answer for the other things, but I don't. But I'm growing a lot more comfortable with that rather than believing in God, because I feel like either way, I don't know anyway. So
Yeah. That is incredibly wise. The thing that is so important to understand for the people who are listening that are in the middle of, as Taylor says, the trenches of deconstruction, is that the believers will ask you to have a fully formed philosophical argument for non-belief or what have you, and you don't have to have that. You don't have to know. You can acknowledge that you no longer believe what you've been told without having a full set of answers that are complete and perfect. And you can then go
right,
on to discover what it is that you believe and why. And you have time, in other words.
right,
But the believers in our lives want to say, no, you have to have an answer for this. And not knowing is
yeah,
good. Like that's actually humble and realistic.
yeah. And I feel like it gives me the opportunity to always be like learning about stuff and also learning from my experiences because I felt like uh, taking all of my morals and values and thoughts from the Bible kind of stopped me from growing as a person because I felt like my thoughts and values and morals were almost kind of always morphing with how much I knew and how much I listened to other people and just And I didn't want that growth to stop. And I felt like if I kept believing in the Bible, it would stop that. And I wasn't really interested in that. And on top of that, my family was very, and I know you hear this a lot in your podcast, but the Donald Trump thing did change a lot for me. It was very strange, but it made me realize that was like a realization I had where I wasn't conservative anymore, and I was like, I can't be a part of this. But there's such a strong people act as if there's a really strong relationship between being a Republican and being Christian. So I felt like a fraud at that point because I'm like, here I am saying, gay marriage is good and abortions are fine, but I'm also being told I can't really be a true Christian and believe those things. So that was part of it too. And I'm not willing to give up. I guess I wasn't really willing to give up my true morals and values just to stay a part of like that community and that faith.
Again, the two things over the last 6 years or so that come up as themes constantly is the acceptance of Donald Trump by the evangelical community, and then the pandemic, being away from church. And the combination, that 1-2 punch of things, has really affected kind of an entire generation of people. And that theme comes up on the podcast over and over again.
Yeah, and like I felt like the one part I did like about Christianity was about being good to people and helping people. And it felt like with that type of change with the Donald Trump thing and some other political things, it felt like there was no room for that anymore. It felt like
Mm-hmm.
it was like a us against or me against the world type of thing. And that's not how I felt. And I was realizing with discussions with people I was surrounded by that my empathy or wanting to accept people was looked at as such a like weakness, and I felt the opposite about it. So that was definitely really frustrating, but that was difficult because I had also, at the same time, I was also volunteering at the rescue mission. And what I saw and experienced there was like the closest I'd ever felt to a type of God was like actually being able to help and interact with these people and like a sense of community. And that was huge for me, but it also changed my mind about a lot of things because I'm like, this is the type of person I want to be and not what the Christians in my life are telling me that I need to be instead.
The major theme of the podcast is what I call secular grace. And you've just eloquently described it, that when you were participating, helping other people, and you feeling that connection, feeling a part of something bigger than yourself, feeling like you were giving, that's secular grace, right? And there's nothing spiritual or, transcendent about that. That's just humans being good to other humans. And we get to keep that, is the thing I want to say, right? After
Right.
deconstruction, you're a human being. You experience awe, you experience connection with other people, you experience community. And all of those things are the best parts of what church were. And you get to keep all that.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's also something I struggled with was, being told as I grew up, and I'm sure a lot of Christians experience this, was like, atheists don't know where to get, or they can't really have good morals, or they can't really pull from anything because they're not being told to. And that also didn't sit right with me because I'm like, why do we have to be told to be a good person? Like, just so that we don't like suffer the consequences instead of like just wanting to. So then my view changed of like, I almost felt like the atheists doing it from the good of their heart were better in a way because they weren't doing it for really any kind of gain. And that's how I felt as well. So that was big for me.
Again, back to the apologetics, I think another thing that we say on the podcast is, if you want to be good to people, you want to be kind to people and do good in the world, and your justification is Christianity, more power to you. Go do that. My justification is that human beings have value. So let me go do that, right? Instead of arguing with each other's justifications. And in regards to morals specifically, the apologists will say that non-believers don't have justification or grounding for their morality. And my point is that neither do they. Right?
Right.
I can have the conversation with that person and point out that they are just as subjective as they're claiming that I am. So like that conversation is just a waste of time, right? We're all human beings. We're
Right.
all winging it. We're all figuring it out as we go.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I was just a lot more interested in that when it came to the religion. But like I said, the more I was reading the Bible, I saw like less of that. It felt like, or any sort of contradictions to it, or you know. And like I said, the biggest part for me was I'm like studying to go into mental health, and I thought to myself, I'm like, how can I truly be a good therapist if I have all these biases? And I mean, I know everyone has biases, but if I kind of have this judgmental thought process, because I felt like religion really pushed me to be a really critical of myself, and I'm sure that had a lot to do with like depression and stuff like that, because I was constantly just nitpicking at everything I did, because I think those kind of teachings that lead you to think you're inherently bad is going to do that. And then since I was doing that to myself, I was doing that to others. And I'm like, can I really accept people and love people and help people with their mental health if this is how I'm thinking of them? And I just felt like the answer was no. I felt like I couldn't be a Christian and also be a good therapist one day if that's what I end up doing.
And that's surprising, right? Like
Yeah,
the expectation is, or what we're told in the bubble is that you can't love people without Jesus. And
right,
so I think part of why this process is so difficult is you are discovering that you are able to love and care for people better outside of the bubble without Jesus, as it were, right? And that's
right.
surprising.
Yeah, it definitely was surprising for me. But then with all of that, I felt a extreme sense of freedom and like a weight off my back in the way that I didn't have like an invisible ghost following me around being like,
Yes.
God, you did that wrong, you did that wrong. And I'm like, oh my God, no one's following me around anymore. This is great. Like I can mess up as a human without it being this like inherently evil thing. Like I can just mess up and make mistakes, and that's okay, because I felt like I always was trying my best, but when I did make any kind of mistake or mess up, it was like this huge thing that I was taught that I was just inherently wicked and it was sinful, instead of it just being part of being a human. And that really took some weight off my shoulders for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think Christians appreciate how damaging the concept of sin is. And for anyone
Mhm.
who is self critical or even self aware, that feedback loop can be really, really dangerous. And the dark side of the concept of grace within Christianity is that you have to really lean into I'm a sinner. And that does
Right.
deep damage to people. And again, one of the difficult parts of deconstruction is letting go of that and accepting yourself as just being human, right?
Right.
The extension of that is accepting other people in their humanity, flaws and all.
Right. Another part that was kind of relieving to me is I felt as if I never really fit the Christian woman expectation, in the way that
Okay.
I never I was never really big into getting married. I was really never big into getting kids. Not to say that stuff will never happen, but I think that it'll probably happen later in life for me, and it's not my like main goal in life.
Uh huh.
And then also, I'm pretty stubborn. I'm not a submissive person at all. So I always felt kind of weird, because a lot of women in my life, that was their role. Like I mean, they had careers and stuff, but they, the husband was the leader, and having kids was like the greatest gift and stuff. And it is a great gift. It just I felt like I was being kind of the odd man out by just like not really caring about those things right now. Because another thing with I feel like that happens with purity culture is people getting married pretty young.
For
And
sure.
I'm like, yeah, and I'm like 28 now, and I feel like some people in my family are looking at me like, "What are you doing?" Like, move on, and I'm like, ah.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's kind of hard to tell them that I'm not even really trying to do that, because it's seems like it's not right with how I grew up. But so that's kind of difficult.
Yeah, and again, the very very common theme of purity culture damaging people, and two things. One, the immense pressure to get married, especially if
Mhm.
you're in a relationship with someone because of sex and the guilt and
Mhm.
shame that's put on you. And the sense of like you need to be breeding for Jesus kind of thing, is definitely in that message that's inescapable as well. I don't know if you heard a few months ago my conversation with Heather Wells. She wrote a book called Trustworthy. It's her memoir of getting married young and having kids young. And she's kind of describing the flip side of the coin of your experience of actually doing the thing that she was supposed to do, but also being a very strong woman, also needing to lead, and felt like she was held back and trying to live up to that impossible standard. So it
Yes.
hurts everybody regardless of what you choose, right?
Yes. Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of stories like that, and I am glad that I wasn't pressured to the point where I felt like I needed to do that like right away. Because I feel like my family, they don't really outright say it. It's just kind of like a, reoccurring theme. But then I also started thinking about, if I were to have my own children, how would I want to raise them and stuff like that. And the idea of telling them about hell at such a young age, because I was also thinking about how I was like, wow, in the Christian community there's no kind of age for you to finally learn about hell. It's like, as at least how I grew up, is just like as soon as they can form a thought, you can tell them about it. And I'm like, wow, that's really intense, because they're shielded from almost everything else, at least how I grew up. And then but this like really massive terrible thing is like told to them so early, and I'm like,
Yeah.
that feels wrong, and it feels like something I couldn't bring myself to do. And I also was thinking about like, if any of my kids, ended up being gay or transgender, I'm like, I wouldn't be mad about it. So if I was a Christian, I would have to pretend to care, and I'm not going to pretend to care about it like in a negative way.
And just like you described your relationship with your dad and how much he loved you and was showing you unconditional love, if you choose to have children someday, you
Mm-hmm.
will feel that. That just is a thing that happens to us when we have kids. And
Right.
and yeah, it is unimaginable to threaten them with hell or make them fearful. That just it doesn't compute. I don't understand how that is a thing.
Right.
But it has damaged many many young people who have grown up with that because kids take it as literal,
Mm-hmm.
and the adults can have some separation from it, but a 5-year-old can't. For a five
Right.
year old, that is a real thing, that is a threat waiting over their head.
Right. And I also didn't want to be, if I had a daughter, I also didn't want to teach her that her value as a person is like tied to her purity, because it feels so wrong, and like I'm already objectifying her at that point. And I don't know, I can't imagine doing that. So that's where I'm like, if I'm not willing to also raise my children in the like Christian way, then I don't really have any business in like staying with something like that. So
Yeah.
along with that was the idea given to me that like, the unequally yoked thing, and not
Mm-hmm.
um marrying someone who's an atheist. And that was always really hard for me because of like what I said, how my values and morals changed. I was way more likely to end up with an atheist. So the thought of like having to date a Christian man, or end up with a Christian man, was like really stressing me out at that point because I was like,
Yeah.
we're not going to have anything in common, at least
Yes. Yeah.
the normal Christian man,
Yeah.
I feel like.
Yeah. And back to the pressure to be married. Often the pool of available partners is very small.
Hmm.
Some people, they grow up in one church and they never leave that church, and they feel obligated to select from that very small candidate pool of people. And
Right.
there's a big wide world out there, right? And, like,
Right.
recognizing what you do and do not like in a partner is a huge part of growing up and becoming an adult. And if outside pressure is trying to tell you tell you what you like, that is doomed to failure.
Right. And like, yeah, I have definitely seen people like get married because they feel like it's the right thing to do and they really struggle. And I'm not saying you're not going to struggle either way, but it's just definitely not a place I wanted to be at. But also I thought about it seems so normal to me growing up, but I thought about the idea that it's almost like Christians feel like getting married is less of a commitment than having sex or living together. And I was like, this feels all backwards. This feels like
Yeah.
you should be doing some of those things before you commit to somebody because that's less of a commitment than marriage, right? I feel like marriage is like one of the biggest commitments, but they want us to get married before any of those things. And that terrified me because I'm like, I don't want to not know what it's like to live with someone before I get married to them. That sounds awful. That sounds scary.
Yeah.
Like it feels like a gamble.
Again, back to Heather Wells and sexuality. Like, you don't know if you and that partner together well sexually or not. And
Right.
that's a big deal. That's a major part of a partnership. And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny to me that I feel like they act like sexual compatibility is just like a fake made up thing, or they just like don't even think of it. Like I've never heard of that, but I'm like, no,
Yeah.
it's definitely a very real thing, and I feel like the struggle, like those struggles can happen, if you get married in the traditional Christian way. And also one thing I learned about while researching and listening to different stories is like how hard it can be for couples who, stay abstinent, stay like completely away from sex or sexual thoughts, and they get married later on down the road, and it's like they have trouble doing it, or they have trouble getting to that point or being intimate with somebody. And that made a lot of sense to me because I'm like, you tell your body and your brain to completely shut down from those things, and then one day you're like, okay, turn back on, you're good. Like I feel like it doesn't work that way, so it made a lot of sense to me.
Exactly.
Yeah, that changed my mind a lot about a lot of things too.
I guess I want to ask a couple questions clarifying. Was there a particular moment, or not moment, but like a realization that you no longer believe? Did you say to yourself at some point, I think I'm going to leave Christianity?
So like I said before with the my job and stuff, I feel like part of that was a really slow burn in the way that I was uh, picking things that I wanted and like throwing away things that I didn't.
Yeah.
But when I really did start doing the researches, the translations were like a huge thing for me. I don't know why, but like I was very concerned about if the Bible was translated correctly and if we were getting the right information. And because for me, if the Bible wasn't correct, everything else was just it was done for me. Like whether there is a God or not, it didn't really matter because we didn't know the exact way of how to do things or what he would do or what he was like. So when I started getting into translations and research about it, and then like I said, with the translation of hell, that's kind of when it was done for me because I felt like that was the one thing kind of clinging me to it was the idea that I could go to hell. And if you believe in hell, it's an absolutely terrifying place. And even the thought of it, I feel like would keep you in your religion or your faith. And if that was kind of falling apart for me, I'm like, well, I don't even have to do this. Like I don't have to do
Yeah.
anything. I can choose what I'm doing. And that was huge for me. Like I was very happy to learn about the health stuff.
Yeah.
So that really helped me out.
And then I'm sorry to even go here, but and you can say no if this is too deep. But like, how are you feeling about the acceptance of the loss of your dad? Is the loss of the idea of heaven more painful, less painful?
I feel like it was really painful at first, and I definitely did have a lot of like hard days and hard nights, and I definitely have been like thinking about him more than ever. But I am not one to completely discredit the idea that we'll see each other again. Like I have no
Okay.
idea.
Okay.
So the idea that we might see each other again is there for me. And honestly, and then on the other side of the spectrum, if it's just like absolutely nothing, I'm becoming more okay with that because, everybody dies. The end comes for everything. It is hard some days, but in other times, I'm like, I don't know. It kind of feels good not to have the pressure because I'm like, what if I go to hell and he's in heaven and whatever? Like, because I feel like
Yeah.
Christians like to believe they know for sure which one they're going to, but even if you believe in it, I feel like most people aren't completely sure, or else that hell anxiety and stuff would not be there. So it feels better for it to be unknown, honestly,
Yeah.
in my
Yeah, I hear
opinion.
you.
It is strange thinking about, because my dad definitely lived out his life like that was his entire life. So thinking about that can make me upset in the way that he did like everything he thought he should all the time, and that's how it ended up for him, which was
Mm.
it was pretty rough at the end. So that kind of makes me angry thinking about it, but you know, that's just part of it.
And again, Taylor, I'm very sorry for your loss. I know how difficult that must be.
Thank
So
you.
I want to hear a little bit about the other side of, I know you say you're kind of still in the middle of things with a bit of acceptance of this deconstruction for you. What is giving you meaning? What has been helpful for you on this side of that?
Yeah, so like research for me really helps. A lot of times I like to hear unbiased things. I know nothing is completely unbiased, but I do like to hear from both sides. Like I listen to a lot of debates. That helps me. And I notice a lot of times I will, this is funny, but I'll start praying and I don't even realize I started doing it because it was such a habit for me. Like at the end of the night or like whatever, I would just start praying. And sometimes when I go to sleep, I automatically start it and then I kind of stop and I'm like, what are things that I could say to myself that like encourage me or make me feel good about where I'm at? And that I guess it's like a form of meditation. I've never really done meditation, but it kind of feels that way. Just kind
Mm-hmm.
of talking myself through things, and that kind of helps because I feel like I was kind of talking to myself the entire time, but wasn't really utilizing it. And I feel like it's good to check in with yourself, and now I'm like actually using it to check in with myself, and I feel like it's extremely beneficial. I also read, I know it's a pretty popular book, the You Are Your Own by Jamie Lee Finch was pretty good for me. um,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
just kind of like like even just the title got me excited. I was like, wow, I I always thought of it like we weren't our own. I even thought about that with my dad. I'm like, well, he wasn't really mine. I can't be upset that, God took him back type thing. But even the title and the entire book was pretty empowering because I'm like, I can like take things back for myself and choose like for myself, which was a pretty big deal for me. And I was pretty excited about that.
Very cool.
So,
Taylor, thank you for telling your story. This has been amazing. I think, as I said at the beginning, this really is this kind of the sweet spot of the podcast. I think many people are going to relate to your story. Do you have any recommendations you have for us?
yeah, I am, like I said, I kind of like listening to like factual things. So there are two YouTube channels I really like. The one is Genetically Modified Skeptic, and the other one is Religion for Breakfast. Sometimes they're not
Mm-hmm.
all about Christianity, but they're very good if you're like wanting to do stuff on the research side of things. So I found that really helpful. And then, but besides that, the Born Again podcast, I know that they're like done with that now, but just or listening through that really did help me because they were also like a younger couple, so that helped me too. And then
Yeah,
like just being very honest and transparent was pretty helpful.
those are great recommendations. Taylor, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Final thoughts on the episode. I really appreciate Taylor's story. I think the loss of a loved one, the loss of a parent is incredibly impacting. And she had the added worries of mental health and drug issues with her mother and trying to protect her father from that in his last days. My heart really goes out to her at how difficult a time that must have been. I'm struck, as always, at how the most faithful look to apologetics to find answers and how unsatisfying apologetic arguments are. It is that doubling down impetus to Jesus harder and make it work, to keep the plates of faith spinning. For many people, it is inevitably leading towards deconstruction, deconversion. Taylor's story also includes the impact of purity culture both on herself and people that she knew. The role of women was a ridiculous restraint for her. We continue to hear from people who have been devastated by purity culture. Her story of participating in feeding the homeless and experiencing community and awe was a perfect demonstration of secular grace. That is exactly what secular grace is. It is loving and caring for people and feeling that sense of belonging within a community. And Taylor exemplifies that quite well. My favorite part about this interview is Taylor describing the huge weight lifted off her back and the freedom that she felt. She says, "I didn't have an invisible ghost following me around telling me how I had done things wrong." She said, "No one is following me around anymore. I can mess up as a human without it being this inherently evil thing. I can just mess up and make mistakes, and that's okay." A reminder that Taylor has an Instagram called skeptical_heretic. Find her there. The link will be in the show notes. I want to thank Taylor for being on the podcast, for telling her story, and sharing with us being in the trenches of deconstruction and deconversion and surviving. Thank you, Taylor. The secular grace thought of the week is the surprising nature of the human ability to love. In the conversation with Taylor, that topic came up. It is only surprising because Christianity tells you that you cannot love people without Jesus. And yet Taylor's description of recognizing that she couldn't be the therapist or the type of therapist that she wanted to be and be a Christian because she would be judging the people instead of actually caring for them. It is that recognition on this side of deconversion that we can embrace our humanity for ourselves. We can embrace the humanity of everyone around us and in all of its beautiful diversity without having to feel like we are obligated to judge. And as I pointed out in the conversation, that is surprising if you grew up in the bubble of evangelical Christianity or some other traditional faith tradition. And the main thing I want to get across here is that religion doesn't own grace. Religion does not own gratitude. Religion does not own awe. Religion doesn't own community. And if you really want your mind blown, Christianity doesn't own Jesus. By looking critically at the words of Jesus in the New Testament, we can take what we want and leave the rest. Coming up, we have a number of community members. In early March, I'll have the episode with Jennifer Michael Hecht about her book, The Wonder Paradox, as well as our 4-year anniversary, which is officially March 14th, but we will release an episode on March 12th, just celebrating the 4 years of the podcast. And after that, we have Arlene interviewing David Hayward, the naked pastor. Really looking forward to that. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.